It's 2 a.m. on a foggy October night in Arlington National Cemetery. The only sound cutting through the silence is the rhythmic click of military boots on marble. A soldier, trained to perfection, maintains his sacred watch over America's unknown heroes. 21 steps forward, pause, 21 steps back. He's done this thousands of times before, but tonight is different. Tonight, he's not alone on that platform. What I'm about to tell you isn't some urban legend passed down through generations. These are documented accounts from 5 different tomb guards who served at one of America's most hallowed grounds. Men who swore an oath to guard the unknown soldier with their lives. Men who don't scare easily. Men who encountered something that defies explanation and haunts them to this day. If you're settling in for the night, maybe turn on an extra light. Because after hearing these 5 terrifying encounters, you'll never look at Arlington Cemetery the same way again. Before we start, give me a little favor. Only 1% of you actually hit the like button. Even though you love these horror stories, 1 second to smash that like helps me grow so much and keeps these daily nightmares coming. Let's dive into the story. March 19th, 2020. 24 hours before the spring equinox, and Private First Class Maria Santos stood in the parking lot of a Washington, D.C. diner at 2 a.m., waiting for 3 people who might think she was insane. She/D managed to track down Rodriguez, Walsh, and Chun through a combination of official records and informal military networks. Getting them to agree to meet her had been the hardest sell of her young life. Rodriguez arrived first, looking every inch the skeptical veteran. He/D been transferred to Fort Bragg after his Phantom Century encounter, but Santos had convinced him to take emergency leave by sharing details of her own supernatural experience that she couldn't/T possibly have known unless she/D truly spoken with the unknown soldiers. Walsh came next, her eyes hollow with the look of someone who hadn't/T slept well in months. Her transfer to a desk job at the Pentagon had been voluntary. She claimed, though Santos could see the truth in her haunted expression. The staff sergeant had seen too much, experienced too much, to ever feel comfortable at a normal duty station again. Chun was last to arrive, and Santos could tell he was questioning his decision to come even as he walked across the empty parking lot. His transfer to Fort Meade had come through just weeks after his encounter with the Phantom Voices, officially described as a /lateral career development opportunity. The 4 guards stood in an awkward circle beside Santos' car, their breath forming clouds in the cold pre-dawn air. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. What do you say to fellow soldiers when you asking them to risk everything based on conversations with the dead? Santos broke the silence. Thank you all for coming. I know this sounds crazy crazy doesn't T begin to cover it. Rodriguez interrupted. You asking us to break into Arlington Cemetery after hours, perform some kind of seance with stolen artifacts, and somehow prevent an ancient evil from taking over the world. If this were a movie, I/D walk out. But you here Walsh pointed out quietly. We all here. Because we VE all seen things that don't T fit into the normal world. Chun nodded reluctantly. The voices I heard beneath the tomb. They knew details about cemetery operations that aren't T available to unauthorized personnel. They knew about incidents from other military cemeteries that aren't T in any public records. And the Phantom Century I encountered knew the exact uniform details and protocols from the 1920s. Rodriguez added. Information that would take weeks of research to fake. Santos felt a surge of hope. They were skeptical, but they were listening. Backslash, the unknown soldiers told me that tonight is our last chance. The spring equinox creates a window of opportunity that only comes once every 160 years. If we don backslash T perform the ritual before dawn, the entity will cross over permanently. Backslash. Backslash, tell us about these artifacts again, backslash Walsh said. Backslash, the items we backslash re supposed to gather, backslash. Santos pulled out a folder containing photocopies of museum records she backslash D obtained through official research requests. Backslash for objects, each representing one of the conflicts memorialized in the tomb. They backslash re currently housed in different military museums around the DC area. Backslash, she spread the papers on the hood of her car. Backslash, a rifle from an unknown doughboy found in a collapsed trench near Belleau in 1918. It backslash S at the National Museum of American History. Backslash. Backslash, a photograph of an unidentified woman found in the pocket of an unknown soldier killed in the Pacific Theater. It backslash S at the Marine Corps Museum in Quantico. Backslash. Backslash, a letter from home recovered from an unknown casualty on Hill 255 in Korea. It backslash S at the Army Heritage Center. Backslash. Backslash, and a blessed medallion found with an unknown soldier in Vietnam. It backslash S currently at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Museum. Backslash. Chun studied the documents carefully. Backslash, these locations are spread across a 50-mile radius. Even if we could somehow access them after hours, we backslash D never be able to collect all 4 items and get back to Arlington before dawn. Backslash. Backslash, actually backslash Santos said with a slight smile, backslash, that backslash, as the one part of this plan that I send backslash T completely insane. I backslash VE been working with the museum curators for the past month, preparing a special exhibition about unknown soldiers for Memorial Day. I have official authorization to transport these artifacts to Arlington for documentation and photography. Backslash. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Backslash, you backslash V been planning this for a month? Backslash. Backslash, the unknown soldiers have been preparing me for this moment since February. They backslash V guided me through every step, helped me anticipate every obstacle. They want to be free from the entity that backslash S been feeding on their sacrifice, and they backslash re willing to help us help them. Backslash. Walsh looked up from the documents. Backslash, what exactly does this ritual involve? You backslash V told us we need the artifacts and we need to be at the tomb before dawn. But what are we actually going to do? Backslash. Santos took a deep breath. She backslash D been dreading this part of the conversation, knowing it would be the hardest sell. Backslash, we form a circle around the tomb, each holding one of the artifacts. We open ourselves to connection with the unknown soldiers, allowing them to share their final moments with us. Backslash. Backslash, their death experiences, you mean backslash Chun said flatly. Backslash, yes, but also their love, their determination, their willingness to sacrifice everything for something larger than themselves. We take that into ourselves and use it to create a barrier the entity cannot cross. Backslash. Backslash, and what backslash S the cost? Backslash Rodriguez asked. Backslash, their backslash S always a cost with this kind of thing. Backslash. Santos met each of their eyes in turn. Backslash, we carry it forever. The pain, the loss, the love, the sacrifice. Once we open that connection, we become bridges between the living and the dead. We backslash all feel the weight of every hero buried in Arlington for the rest of our lives. Backslash. The silence that followed was deafening. Santos could practically hear each guard calculating the implications, weighing the personal cost against the potential consequences of doing nothing. Finally, Walsh spoke. Show me the artifacts. They spent the next hour driving between museum locations, using Santos official authorization to collect the 4 items. Each artifact felt warm to the touch, as if it carried within it some essential spark of the soldier who had died carrying it. The rifle still bore traces of mud from French trenches. The photograph showed a young woman with kind eyes and a hopeful smile. The letter was written in a shaky hand that spoke of love and homesickness. The medallion had been worn smooth by nervous fingers in a hostile jungle. By 4:30 a.m., they were back at Arlington, using Santos security clearance to access the memorial grounds. The tomb platform looked different in the pre-dawn darkness, somehow larger and more imposing than any of them remembered from their regular duties. This is really happening, Chen muttered as they climbed the marble steps. We really about to perform a supernatural ritual based on instructions from dead soldiers. Second thoughts? Santos asked. Constant second thoughts. Rodriguez replied. But I am still here. They arranged themselves around the tomb in the pattern Santos had seen in her visions. Rodriguez at the north holding the World War I rifle. Walsh at the east cradling the Pacific Theater photograph. Chun at the south gripping the Korean War letter. Santos at the west, her fingers wrapped around the Vietnam medallion. Now what? Walsh asked. Now we open ourselves to their sacrifice. Santos said. We let them show us what it means to die for something greater than yourself. She placed her free hand on the marble surface of the tomb. Unknown soldiers of America. We here to help you find peace. We here to stop the entity that feeds on your sacrifice. Show us what we need to do. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The dark liquid began to flow down the marble surface again, but this time it glowed with warm light that seemed to emanate from within. The other guards gasped as they felt the connection establish itself, flooding their consciousness with sensations and memories that weren't their own. Rodriguez experienced the terror and determination of a young doughboy facing poison gas attacks in France, but also the profound love for his fellow soldiers that kept him at his post despite the horror. Walsh felt the final moments of a Marine dying on a Pacific beach, but also his fierce pride in his unit and his unwavering belief in the cause he was dying for. Chun shared the agony of a soldier freezing to death on a Korean hillside, but also his desperate hope that his sacrifice would help preserve freedom for people he would never meet. Santos experienced the confusion and pain of a young man dying in a Vietnamese jungle, but also his deep love for his family back home and his determination to protect his brothers in arms. But through all of these individual death experiences, the 4 guards began to sense something else. A presence that was definitely not one of the unknown soldiers. Something ancient and hungry, circling the edges of their consciousness like a predator waiting for an opportunity to strike. The entity, it had been drawn by the ritual, sensing the opening between worlds that the guards had created. Santos could feel its alien intelligence probing their connection, looking for a way to use their bridge between realms to cross over into the living world. /S here /. She whispered through gritted teeth. /S trying to use our connection. The unknown soldiers voices rose in urgent warning. Hold fast. Don T let it through. Remember why you here. The entity S presence grew stronger, more oppressive. Santos felt it pressing against her consciousness, trying to overwhelm her with despair and hopelessness. It showed her visions of what would happen if it crossed over. Military cemeteries around the world becoming feeding grounds. The honored dead of every nation being consumed by its insatiable hunger for heroic sacrifice. But the guards held their positions, drawing strength from the artifacts they carried and the connection they shared with the unknown soldiers. Rodriguez felt the determination of countless doughboys who had held the line against impossible odds. Walsh channeled the courage of Marines who had fought their way across the Pacific despite overwhelming enemy resistance. Chun drew upon the resilience of soldiers who had endured the bitter cold of Korean winters. Santos connected with the love and sacrifice of young men who had died far from home in Vietnamese jungles. The entity /S assault intensified, but it met something it hadn't /T expected. Not just 4 living guards, but 400,000 unknown soldiers standing with them. Every hero buried in Arlington, every soul that had been tormented by the entity /S feeding, joined their combined will to a single purpose: the protection of sacred ground, the defense of heroic sacrifice, the preservation of honored memory. As dawn approached on March 20th, the spring equinox arrived with a surge of supernatural energy that the entity tried to ride across the barrier between worlds. But instead of finding weakness, it encountered strength. Instead of finding isolated victims, it met unified resistance. The 4 guards felt the moment when the barrier solidified, when their combined will and the support of Arlington /S honored dead created a wall that the entity could not cross. The dark presence retreated, howling with frustration, back to whatever realm had spawned it. But victory came with a price. Santos felt the change immediately. The pain and love and sacrifice of every hero buried in Arlington flowed into her consciousness, not as a brief, overwhelming experience, but as a permanent part of her being. She would carry their stories, their final moments, their unfulfilled dreams for the rest of her life. Rodriguez, Walsh, and Chun experienced the same transformation. They had become bridges between the living and the dead, guardians not just of marble and bronze, but of the very essence of heroic sacrifice. As the sun rose over Arlington Cemetery on March 20th, 2020, the 4 guards slowly released their hold on the artifacts and each other. The tomb no longer wept dark liquid, but stood clean and serene in the morning light. Is it over? Chin asked. For now, Santos replied, though she could feel the permanent change within herself. The barriers are stronger. The entity can /T cross over, at least not for another 160 years. And us? Walsh asked. What happens to us now? Santos smiled, though tears streamed down her face. We carry them with us. All of them. Every hero buried here becomes part of who we are. We become living memorials to their sacrifice. Rodriguez looked around at his fellow guards, then at the tomb that had brought them together. I can think of worse fates. They returned the artifacts to their respective museums, filed reports that mentioned nothing supernatural, and went back to their assigned duty stations. But they remained connected, bound together by their shared experience and their permanent link to Arlington /S honored dead. And sometimes, late at night when the moon is dark and the fog rolls in from the Potomac, visitors to Arlington National Cemetery report seeing not just the regulation guard walking his 21 steps, but 4 figures standing watch together, protecting America /S unknown heroes from threats both living and dead. Because some duties transcend death itself, and some sacrifices echo through eternity. Private First Class Maria Santos had been assigned to the tomb guard for only 6 weeks when she experienced what would later be documented as the most disturbing supernatural encounter in Arlington /S modern history. It was February 14th, 2020, Valentine /S Day. though there was nothing romantic about what Santos witnessed that frigid night. Santos had drawn the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift, the deep graveyard hours when the cemetery felt most isolated from the living world. She requested the assignment specifically, wanting to prove herself worthy of the honor that came with guarding America's unknown heroes. At 19 years old, Santos was the youngest guard currently assigned to the tomb, and she felt the weight of that responsibility with every measured step of her patrol. The night started like any other. Clear skies, temperature hovering around 20 degrees, a sharp wind cutting across the memorial platform that made her eyes water despite her rigorous training in weather endurance. Santos settled into her rhythm quickly, finding comfort in the precise choreography of her duty. 21 steps south, pause for 21 seconds. About face, pause again, 21 steps north. But at 3:17 a.m., as Santos reached the midpoint of her southward march, she noticed something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The tomb was weeping. Dark streaks ran down the white marble face of the sarcophagus, as if the stone itself was crying tears of black oil. Santos blinked hard, certain she must be seeing things. Marble didn't /T weep. Stone didn't /T cry. There had to be a logical explanation, condensation maybe, or some kind of staining from the metal fittings. But as Santos completed her march to the southern end of the platform and turned to face the tomb directly, she could see the dark streaks clearly in the memorial lighting. They weren't /T random water stains or metal oxidation. They flowed from specific points on the marble surface in perfect vertical lines, like tears streaming down a human face. Santos approached the tomb, breaking protocol for the first time since beginning her assignment. Every instinct told her to maintain her patrol route, to not deviate from the precise movements that honored the unknown soldiers within. But something stronger compelled her forward, a need to understand what she was witnessing. As she drew closer to the marble sarcophagus, Santos could see that the dark streaks weren't /T oil or staining at all. They were some kind of liquid, still wet, still flowing slowly down the stone surface. But the liquid wasn't /T water. It was too dark, too thick, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Santos reached out with one gloved hand to touch one of the mysterious streams. The moment her fingers made contact with the dark liquid, she was overwhelmed by a flood of sensations that nearly drove her to her knees. Pain. Unimaginable pain from wounds she /D never received. The agony of bullets tearing through flesh, of shrapnel embedding in bone, of poison gas burning through lungs. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional anguish that accompanied it. The desperate love of family members who would never know what happened to their sons, their husbands, their brothers. Santos jerked her hand back as if she /D been burned, but the sensations continued to flood through her consciousness. She was experiencing the final moments of the unknown soldiers entombed within the marble. Not just one death, but multiple deaths across multiple wars. The trenches of World War I, where poison gas turned brave men into drowning victims on dry land. The beaches of World War II, where young soldiers charged into machine gun fire knowing they wouldn't /T survive but hoping their sacrifice would save others. The frozen hills of Korea, where men died in temperatures so cold their blood froze in their veins. The jungles of Vietnam, where heroes fell to enemies they never saw coming. But within these final moments of agony, Santos felt something else. Love. Profound, selfless love for country, for fellow soldiers, for families back home, for ideals worth dying for. These men had faced death not with hatred or anger, but with love so pure it transcended their physical destruction. The dark liquid on the tomb wasn't /T tears of sorrow, Santos realized. It was the essence of that love, made manifest through some supernatural process she couldn't /T begin to understand. The unknown soldiers were weeping love itself, and that love was trying to tell her something. Santos pressed both palms against the weeping marble, allowing the flood of sensations to overwhelm her completely. Through the chaos of multiple death experiences, she began to hear voices. Not the phantom whispers that Chun had described in his unofficial reports, but clear, strong voices speaking directly into her consciousness. Private Santos. The voice belonged to a young man, probably not much older than herself. We been waiting for someone like you. Someone with the gift to feel what we feel. What gift? Santos managed to whisper, though speaking while experiencing multiple death agonies nearly impossible. Empathy. Came a different voice, this one older, weathered by battle. The ability to share in sacrifice. Most of the living guards can see us or hear us, but you can feel us. Feel what we experienced. Feel what we re-experiencing now. We re not at rest, private, said a third voice, tinged with desperate urgency. None of us are at rest. Something is preventing our souls from finding peace. Through the overwhelming sensations, Santos managed to form words. What is preventing it? The voices began speaking over each other, creating a symphony of urgent explanation that somehow Santos could follow perfectly. Their an entity that feeds on heroic death. It been trapped on the other side for centuries, but the barriers are weakening. Every year it grows stronger, more able to influence our realm. It been drawing power from military cemeteries around the world, but Arlington represents something special. The concentration of willing sacrifice here is unprecedented. If it can establish a foothold here, it can spread to every place where heroes are honored. It feeds on the love we died with, the nobility of our sacrifice. But it doesn't honor that sacrifice. Consumes it, corrupts it. Santos felt tears streaming down her own face as she absorbed not just the words, but the emotions behind them. These souls weren't at rest because something was actively feeding on their final moments of heroic love, preventing them from moving on to whatever came after death. How long has this been happening? She asked. Since the beginning, came the collective response. Since the first hero was buried in sacred ground, but it accelerating now, growing bolder. The spring equinox represents a convergence point, explained the first voice. March 20th will mark exactly 160 years since Arlington was established. 160 years of accumulated heroic sacrifice concentrated in one location. The entity has been preparing for this moment. If it can cross over during the equinox, if it can establish itself permanently in our realm, it will begin consuming heroic sacrifice on a massive scale. Santos saw flashes of images through her connection to the unknown soldiers. Dark visions of what would happen if the entity succeeded. Military cemeteries around the world becoming feeding grounds. War memorials turning into portals for supernatural parasites. The honored dead of every nation being consumed by something that perverted their sacrifice into fuel for its own malevolent existence. What can I do? Santos asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. The other guards have seen pieces of the truth, the voices explained. Rodriguez witnessed our attempts to maintain watch despite death. Walsh was warned by one of our brothers from the Pacific Theater. Chun heard us trying to communicate directly. But you can do something they cannot. You can feel our pain, our love, our determination. You can carry that feeling to the living world and help them understand what is at stake. Their is a ritual, said the oldest voice, speaking with the authority of someone who had faced impossible odds and somehow survived, at least until his final battle. A way to strengthen the barriers that separate the realms. but it requires cooperation between the living and the dead. Santos felt her consciousness being pulled deeper into connection with the unknown soldiers. She found herself experiencing not just their deaths, but their lives, their training, their camaraderie, their hopes and dreams cut short by war. She felt their determination to protect something larger than themselves, even at the cost of everything they held dear. The ritual must be performed by living guards who understand the true nature of their duty, the voices continued. Guards who recognize that they /re not just protecting marble and bronze, but the very essence of heroic sacrifice itself. It requires objects of power from each conflict represented in the tomb, items that carry the emotional resonance of the wars that created us. And it requires the willing participation of spirits who refuse to be consumed, souls who choose to fight back against the entity that feeds on heroic death. Santos began to see flashes of specific items: a rifle carried through the trenches of World War I, a photograph of a sweetheart carried through the Pacific Campaign of World War II, a letter from home, blood-stained but still readable, found on a frozen battlefield in Korea, a medallion blessed by a field chaplain, discovered in the Vietnamese jungle. These items exist, the voices assured her. They /re kept in the archives of the various military museums, cataloged as artifacts from unknown soldiers whose remains were never recovered. The civilian historians /T understand their true significance, but they preserve them nonetheless. You must convince the living guards to gather these items. You must make them understand that March 20th represents a deadline that cannot be missed. And you must prepare them for what the ritual will require. Santos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February night air. What will it require? The voices grew quieter, more solemn. The living guards must be willing to share in our sacrifice. Not death, but something almost as difficult. They must be willing to carry a portion of our pain, our loss, our unfulfilled love for the rest of their lives. The barrier between realms can only be strengthened by joining the living and the dead in common cause, by creating a bridge of shared sacrifice that the entity cannot cross or corrupt. But the guards who participate will be forever changed. They will carry within them the echo of heroic death. They will feel, for the rest of their lives, the weight of every sacrifice made by every hero buried in Arlington. Santos understood immediately why this knowledge had been hidden from the living guards. Who would willingly accept such a burden? Who would choose to carry the pain of hundreds of thousands of heroic deaths for the rest of their natural life? But she also understood that someone had to make that choice. Because if the entity crossed over on March 20th, if it established itself permanently in the realm of the living, the alternative would be far worse than any personal sacrifice. "I'll do it," Santos whispered to the weeping stone. "I'll convince the others. I'll help perform the ritual." The dark liquid flowing down the marble began to glow with a faint, warm light. The overwhelming pain Santos had been experiencing gradually transformed into something else. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something so beautiful it made the pain worthwhile. "Hope." "Thank you, Private Santos," the voices said in unison. "But remember, you cannot do this alone. You must find Rodriguez, Walsh, and Chun. You must convince them to join you despite the cost. And you must do it quickly. The entity grows stronger each day. By March 20th, it may be too late for any ritual to stop what is coming." The connection began to fade, the voices growing distant as Santos' consciousness returned fully to her own body. The dark streams on the marble were drying up, leaving only faint traces of their supernatural origin. But Santos carried within her now something far more than memories of the encounter. She carried a piece of each unknown soldier /s final moments of love and determination. She understood, in a way that no living person should have to understand, exactly what heroic sacrifice felt like from the inside. And she knew that in exactly 34 days, on March 20th, that understanding would either save Arlington Cemetery or die with her in the attempt. Santos completed her shift with new purpose, her patrol taking on deeper meaning now that she knew she was walking among souls who could not rest. When the Dawn Guard arrived, she almost shared everything she /D experienced. Almost, but she realized she needed to approach this strategically. Rodriguez, Walsh, and Chun had all been transferred or reassigned after their supernatural encounters. If Santos reported hers through official channels, she would likely suffer the same fate, leaving Arlington vulnerable with no one who understood the true threat. Instead, she would have to find the other guards privately, convince them to return to Arlington, and somehow persuade them to participate in a ritual that would forever change their lives. All before March 20th. All before the spring equinox brought something ancient and hungry across the barrier between worlds. Something that had been waiting 160 years to feast on the concentrated heroic sacrifice of Arlington National Cemetery. Corporal David Chun had always prided himself on having nerves of steel. 2 tours in Afghanistan, countless high-stress situations, and 8 months guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier had taught him to stay calm under pressure. But nothing in his military experience had prepared him for what he would hear on the night of January 19, 2020. It started with the boots. Chun was halfway through his midnight shift when he first noticed the sound. A rhythmic clicking on marble that perfectly matched his own footsteps, but came from somewhere else entirely. At first, he assumed it was an echo, some acoustic quirk of the memorial architecture that he /D simply never noticed before. The tomb platform was surrounded by marble walls and columns that could easily create strange sound effects, especially on a still night like this one. But as Chun continued his patrol 21 steps south, pause, about face, pause, 21 steps north, he realized the duplicate footsteps weren't /T quite synchronized with his own. They were offset by just a fraction of a second, creating an eerie doubling effect that made his skin crawl. Chun stopped abruptly at the northern end of his route. The other footsteps continued for exactly 3 more steps before stopping as well. The silence that followed was deafening. Chun stood motionless, straining his ears, trying to determine the source of the phantom marching. The night was clear and calm, with minimal wind to carry sounds from other parts of the cemetery. Security protocols meant no other personnel should be anywhere near the tomb at this hour. After several long seconds, Chun resumed his patrol. The moment his boots touched the marble, the duplicate footsteps began again. Step for step, pause for pause, but always just slightly out of sync with his own movements. It was like having a shadow made of sound, following his every move but never quite keeping up. As the minutes passed, Chun noticed something else disturbing about the phantom footsteps. They weren't /T coming from ground level. They seemed to emanate from somewhere beneath the marble platform, as if someone was marching in a space that shouldn't /T exist under the tomb. Chun had studied the memorial /S construction extensively during his training. He knew every detail of the tomb /S architecture, including the fact that it was built on a solid foundation of concrete and bedrock. There were no underground chambers, no hollow spaces that could account for the sounds he was hearing. Yet the footsteps continued, growing more distinct with each passing minute. At 2:15 a.m., as Chun completed another circuit of his patrol route, the phantom marching suddenly changed. Instead of mirroring his movements, the unseen walker began to perform a different pattern entirely. While Chun executed his regulation 21 steps south, the phantom took what sounded like a longer route, perhaps 25 or 30 steps, ending at a different location entirely. Chun paused at his southern position and listened carefully. The phantom walker paused as well, But the sound came from somewhere off to the east, beyond the marble platform entirely. It was as if the invisible marcher was patrolling a completely different area, following a route that existed only in memory or some other dimension. Then Chun heard something that nearly shattered his military composure entirely. The sound of multiple sets of footsteps. What had started as a single phantom walker now became two, then three, then four distinct patterns of marching. Each followed its own route, each maintained its own rhythm, but all moved with the precise, measured cadence of trained military guards. Chun stood frozen at his post, listening to what sounded like an entire platoon of invisible sentries performing their eternal watch beneath his feet. The cacophony of ghostly boots on phantom marble created a symphony of duty that transcended death itself. But the most unnerving part wasn't the number of phantom walkers or even the impossibility of their existence. It was their apparent awareness of Chun himself. As the living guard resumed his patrol, all of the phantom marchers adjusted their routes to mirror his movements. When he walked south, they walked south. When he paused, they paused. It was as if they were following his lead, allowing him to set the pace for their ghostly formation. For over an hour, Chun continued his watch while the phantom guards performed their own eternal patrol beneath the tomb. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and deeply moving. Here was evidence that the bonds of military duty transcended even death, that the oath to guard America / unknown heroes extended beyond the boundaries of the living world. But at 3:30 a.m., the phantom footsteps suddenly stopped. Chun had just begun his march from the northern end of the platform when the ghostly symphony abruptly cut off mid-step. The silence was so complete and sudden that Chun stumbled, his rhythm disrupted by the absence of the sound he had grown accustomed to over the past hour and a half. Then he heard something far more disturbing than marching feet. Voices, whispered conversations in what sounded like multiple languages, all coming from beneath the marble platform. Chun could make out English, but also what sounded like French, German, maybe Russian or Polish. The words were too quiet to understand, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, even desperate. Chun knelt down and pressed his ear to the cold marble, trying to make sense of the phantom conversations. What he heard made his blood turn to ice. The voices weren't / speaking to each other. They were speaking to him, Corporal Chun. The voice came from directly beneath where he knelt, clear as if someone was lying just under the marble surface. Corporal David Chun of the 3rd Infantry Regiment. Chun jerked back from the platform as if it had burned him. There was no way anyone could know his name, his rank, his unit, while speaking from beneath solid stone and concrete. But the voice continued, now joined by others. We / been waiting for you, Corporal. Waiting for someone who could hear us. Someone who could carry our message to the living. The barriers are failing, Corporal Chun. What happened to Walsh was just the beginning. Chun felt his heart skip a beat. Walsh, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh, had been transferred to another duty station just 2 weeks ago. Her departure had been sudden, unexplained, and accompanied by rumors that she / requested the transfer after some kind of incident while on guard duty. No one would give Chun details, but he / heard whispers about psychological evaluation and stress-related transfer. What do you know about Walsh? Chun whispered to the marble beneath his feet. She saw him, came the reply from multiple phantom voices. The old soldier, the one who tried to warn her, but she couldn't / convince the living. She couldn't / make them understand. Understand what? The voices began speaking over each other, creating a chorus of urgent warnings that Chun struggled to follow. December 21st was just a test, a probing of the barriers. Something found the weak points. It coming back, stronger this time. Spring equinox. March 20th. When death awakens with the earth. When the sacrifice threshold will be crossed. Chun felt panic rising in his chest. What sacrifice threshold? What are you talking about? The phantom voices suddenly became clearer, speaking in unison like a ghostly chorus. Arlington Cemetery contains the remains of over 400,000 service members. Corporal Chun. 400,000 souls who died in service to their country. That much willing sacrifice, that much heroic death, creates power. Power that certain entities crave. Every year on the spring equinox, the barrier between worlds grows thin. But this year is different. This year marks the 160th anniversary of Arlington/S founding. 160 years of accumulated heroic death, concentrated in one location. Something ancient has been watching, waiting for exactly this moment, when the sacrifice threshold would be high enough to sustain it in the living world. Chun/S mind reeled. Sustain what? What/S trying to cross over? The voices grew fainter, as if the phantom speakers were being pulled away from the boundary between worlds. It feeds on honor, on nobility, on the willing sacrifice of heroes. The more it consumes, the stronger it becomes. And Arlington Cemetery represents the largest concentration of heroic death in the Western Hemisphere. If it crosses over during the spring equinox, if it establishes itself here, it will spread. Every military cemetery, every war memorial, every place where heroes are honored will become a feeding ground. You have to warn them, Corporal. You have to make them understand. Rodriguez saw the phantom sentry trying to communicate. Walsh saw the old soldier trying to warn her. Now you/V heard us directly. The pattern is accelerating. The entity is growing bolder. March 20th is only 2 months away. The phantom voices were now barely whispers, fading like radio signals losing their frequency. Find the others, Corporal Chun. Find Rodriguez and Walsh. Find anyone else who has seen or heard us. The living and the dead must work together to protect this sacred ground. Before it/is too late. Before the spring equinox. Before the feeders cross over for good. The voices faded completely, leaving Chen alone on the marble platform with nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat and the distant hum of traffic. But the silence felt different now, pregnant with menace and unspoken warnings. Chun completed his shift in a state of shock, going through the motions of his patrol while his mind raced with implications of what he/D heard. When the Dawn Guard arrived for the changing of the guard ceremony, Chun almost broke protocol and shared everything. Almost, but something held him back. The same instinct that had kept Rodriguez and Walsh from immediately reporting their own encounters. The knowledge that such a story, no matter how sincerely told, would likely result in psychological evaluation and transfer to another duty station. Instead, Chun spent his off-duty hours researching. He started with Arlington/S official records, looking for any mention of unusual occurrences around the spring equinox. What he found was troubling, but not nearly as disturbing as what he discovered when he expanded his search to include military cemeteries worldwide. March 20th, 1995, Normandy American Cemetery, France. Multiple visitors reported seeing dark figures moving among the headstones during the spring equinox ceremony. March 20th, 2003, Manila American Cemetery, Philippines. Groundskeepers reported that dozens of graves appeared disturbed, as if something had tried to dig up from the inside. March 20th, 2011, Cambridge American Cemetery, England. Security cameras captured what appeared to be shadowy forms moving between the graves, but the figures cast no shadows and left no footprints. The pattern was global. Every major military cemetery, every significant memorial to fallen heroes, experienced unusual activity during the spring equinox. But the incidents were always dismissed as pranks, optical illusions, or equipment malfunctions. Chun realized he was looking at evidence of a phenomenon that had been occurring for years, possibly decades, but had never been connected or understood as part of a larger pattern. Something was indeed testing the barriers between worlds, probing for weaknesses, growing stronger with each attempt. And Arlington Cemetery, with its massive concentration of heroic sacrifice, represented the ultimate prize. Chun also realized he couldn't handle this alone. He needed to find Rodriguez and Walsh, needed to compare their experiences and figure out what the phantom voices expected them to do. Because March 20th was indeed approaching fast, and if the phantom guards were right, the spring equinox would bring something to Arlington Cemetery that would make their previous supernatural encounters look like gentle warnings. Something that fed on the nobility and sacrifice that made Arlington sacred. Something that grew stronger with each heroic soul it consumed. Something that had been waiting 160 years for exactly the right moment to cross over permanently into the world of the living. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh thought she had seen everything during her 2 years guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier. Summer thunderstorms that turned the marble platform into a lightning rod. Blizzards that made each step a battle against nature itself. Even the occasional drunk tourist who somehow made it past security in the middle of the night. But nothing had prepared her for the visitor she encountered on December 7, 2019. Pearl Harbor Day, a date that carries special significance at Arlington Cemetery, where so many World War II veterans rest in eternal peace. Walsh had volunteered for the midnight shift, wanting to honor their sacrifice with her vigilant watch. It seemed fitting somehow to stand guard on such a solemn anniversary. The night started normally enough. Clear skies, temperature hovering just above freezing, a gentle breeze rustling through the bare winter trees. Walsh settled into her rhythm easily. 21 steps south, pause, about face, pause, 21 steps north. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air, dissipating quickly in the breeze. The only sounds were her own footsteps and the distant hum of traffic from Memorial Drive. At 1:30 a.m., as Walsh completed her northern turn and began her measured march back toward the tomb, she noticed a figure standing at the base of the marble steps. Her first instinct was security breach. Someone had somehow gotten past the perimeter, past the cameras, past all the layers of protection that surrounded America's most sacred military site. Walsh's hand moved instinctively toward her radio, ready to call for backup. But something stopped her. Something about the way the figure stood, motionless and respectful, hands clasped behind his back. The man appeared to be elderly, dressed in what looked like a World War II-era military uniform. Even from a distance, Walsh could make out the distinctive cut of the jacket, the peaked cap, the ribbons on his chest that spoke of service in a forgotten war. He stood with perfect military bearing, spine straight, chin up, eyes fixed on the tomb with an expression of profound reverence. Walsh continued her patrol, but kept the visitor in her peripheral vision. Protocol dictated that she should immediately report any unauthorized personnel in the restricted area. But something held her back. Maybe it was the date Pearl Harbor Day. Maybe it was the respectful way the old soldier stood vigil. Or maybe it was something deeper, an instinct that told her this encounter was different from any security situation she'd been trained to handle. As Walsh reached the southern end of her patrol route, she got her first clear look at the visitor's face. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The old soldier was translucent, not completely see-through like something from a movie, but faded, as if he were being viewed through layers of morning mist. His uniform, while clearly visible, seemed to shift and waver in the night air, and his face, weathered and lined with age, held an expression of such profound sadness that Walsh felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes. But it was his eyes that truly unnerved her. They weren't looking at the tomb anymore. They were looking directly at Walsh herself. The phantom veteran raised one trembling hand and beckoned to her. Walsh felt every instinct in her body screaming at her to call for backup, to follow protocol, to treat this as the security emergency it clearly was. But a stronger instinct, something deeper than training, told her to approach the mysterious figure. Against all regulations, against all common sense, Walsh stepped off her patrol route and walked slowly toward the base of the memorial steps. As she drew closer, she could make out more details of the old soldier's appearance. His uniform bore the insignia of the Pacific Theater, ribbons that spoke of campaigns in places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. His face was deeply lined, not just with age but with the weight of memories that no human being should have to carry. When Walsh was within 10 feet of the phantom veteran, he began to speak. His voice was barely a whisper, like wind through autumn leaves, but every word was crystal clear. "They're not resting," he said, his eyes never leaving Walsh's face. "The boys, our boys, they're not resting." Walsh felt her training kick in despite the supernatural nature of the encounter. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself and explain how you gained access to this restricted area." The old soldier smiled sadly. "Access? Child, I've been here for 78 years. This is where I belong. This is where we all belong." "Sir, I don't understand." "The tomb," the phantom interrupted, gesturing toward the marble sarcophagus behind Walsh. "Do you know what's really in there?" Walsh felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. The remains of unknown soldiers from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. "Unknown," the old soldier repeated, his voice growing fainter. "But not unforgotten. Never unforgotten. We know who they are. We've always known. And they know something's coming." The phantom veteran began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing second. But his voice grew more urgent, more desperate. "Listen to me, Sergeant Walsh. Listen carefully. Something is stirring in the deeper graves. Something that shouldn't be disturbed. The boys in the tomb, they're trying to warn you. That's why we're appearing, why we're breaking through the veil. The dead don't rest easy when evil walks among the living." "What kind of evil?" Walsh managed to ask, though her voice was barely a whisper. "The kind that feeds on sacrifice," the phantom replied. "The kind that grows stronger in places where blood has been spilled for noble causes. Arlington isn't just a cemetery, Sergeant. It's a repository of heroic death, of willing sacrifice. And something ancient and hungry has noticed." The old soldier was now so faded that Walsh could see the monument steps through his body. But his eyes remained fixed on hers, burning with desperate intensity. "December 21st, he said, his voice now barely audible. "Winter solstice, the longest night. That's when it will try to cross over. That's when the barriers are weakest. You have to warn the others. You have to make them understand." "Warn them about what?" Walsh called out, but the phantom veteran was already gone, dissolved into the cold December air like morning mist. Walsh stood alone at the base of the memorial steps, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echoing off the marble walls. She looked around frantically, searching for any sign of the mysterious visitor. But there was nothing, just the empty platform, the eternal flame flickering in its bronze bowl, and the tomb itself standing silent sentinel over America's unknown heroes. For several long minutes, Walsh remained motionless, trying to process what had just occurred. Then her military training reasserted itself. She returned to her patrol route and resumed her watch, 21 steps south. Pause, About face, pause, 21 steps north. But her mind was racing. December 21st was only 2 weeks away. The remainder of Walsh's shift passed without incident, but she couldn't shake the phantom veteran's words. Something is stirring in the deeper graves. The dead don't rest easy when evil walks among the living. December 21st, the longest night. When the dawn guard arrived for the 6 a.m. ceremony, Walsh almost said something, almost broke protocol and shared her supernatural encounter. But at the last moment, she held back. Who would believe her? What could she possibly say that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of a guard who'd been on too many midnight shifts? Instead, Walsh spent her off-duty hours researching. She dove deep into the archives of Arlington Cemetery, looking for any mention of unusual occurrences around the winter solstice. What she found made her blood run cold. December 21st, 1943. A security guard reported seeing multiple figures in military uniforms walking among the graves. But when investigated, no unauthorized personnel were found on the grounds. December 21st, 1967. Night maintenance crew reported tools moving on their own and the sound of marching feet with no visible source. December 21st, 1989. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a large gathering of translucent figures near the tomb of the unknown soldier, all facing toward the deeper sections of the cemetery as if watching for something. December 21st, 2001. Just months after September 11th, 3 different guards reported encounters with phantom soldiers warning of impending danger. The pattern was clear. Every winter solstice for decades, the supernatural activity at Arlington Cemetery spiked dramatically. And according to the phantom veteran Walsh had encountered, this year would be different. This year, something was actually trying to cross over. But cross over from where and why? Walsh found part of her answer in a dusty file buried deep in the cemetery's administrative records. A file marked Sensitive Historical Documents, Restricted Access. A file that contained correspondence between Arlington's administrators and various military officials dating back to the cemetery's founding. In a letter dated March 15, 1864, just after Arlington was established on the confiscated grounds of Robert E. Lee's estate, the first cemetery superintendent reported strange occurrences among the earliest burials. Graves that seemed to glow with an inner light. The sound of voices singing hymns in languages no one recognized. And most disturbing, reports from local residents of dark figures gathering at the cemetery's borders on the nights when the veil between worlds grew thin. The superintendent had consulted with local clergy and indigenous tribal leaders. Both groups told him the same thing. The land that became Arlington Cemetery sat atop what the Native Americans called a thin place, a location where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was naturally weak. The massive number of heroic deaths, the willing sacrifices made by the men and women buried there, had strengthened that weakness over time. Most spirits, the tribal elders explained, crossed over peacefully, drawn by the nobility of their deaths and the honor accorded their remains. But occasionally, something else noticed the thin place. Something that fed on sacrifice and heroism. Something that grew stronger with each honorable death. The correspondence indicated that various measures had been taken over the years to strengthen the barriers and maintain the sanctity of the cemetery. Specific rituals, blessed objects, protective wards that were renewed annually by military chaplains from various faiths. But the final document in the file was a memo dated November 30th, 2019, just 1 week before Walsh's encounter with the phantom veteran. Budget cuts had eliminated many of the cemetery's non-essential ceremonial functions. The annual blessing rituals had been quietly discontinued. The barriers were weakening, and something on the other side had noticed. Walsh realized she was holding information that could mean the difference between a peaceful winter solstice and something far more sinister. But she also realized she couldn't act alone. She needed to find the other guards who had experienced supernatural encounters. She needed to piece together their stories and figure out what the phantom sentries were really trying to tell them. Because December 21st was still coming. The longest night was still approaching. And somewhere in the deeper graves of Arlington Cemetery, something ancient and hungry was preparing to cross over into the world of the living. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos had earned her position as a tomb guard through exceptional dedication and an unwavering commitment to honoring America's fallen heroes. Her background in military intelligence had taught her to observe details that others missed, to notice patterns that revealed hidden truths. These skills would prove invaluable during her most extraordinary encounter with the supernatural residents of Arlington National Cemetery. It began on a crystal-clear April night when the moon was full and every shadow seemed sharp enough to cut glass. Santos had been walking her post for just over an hour when she first noticed the additional shadow. Not her own, which moved predictably with each step, but another shadow that seemed to walk alongside her, matching her pace perfectly. At first, Santos attributed the extra shadow to a trick of moonlight reflecting off the tomb's marble surfaces. Arlington's monument was designed to catch and reflect light in ways that honored the unknown soldiers resting within. But as she continued her measured march, the shadow became more distinct, more obviously human in shape and movement. Santos was too professional to break her routine, but she began observing the shadow with the analytical skills that had made her an exceptional intelligence specialist. The shadow moved with military bearing, maintaining perfect posture and timing. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried itself with the confidence of an experienced soldier. Most remarkably, it seemed to be wearing a different style of uniform than her own. The shadow marched with Santos for her entire shift, never wavering, never falling out of step. It was as if she had been assigned a partner for guard duty, someone who understood the sacred nature of the mission and was determined to help her fulfill it perfectly. Santos found the presence comforting rather than frightening. The shadow seemed protective, watchful, ready to assist if any threat should arise. As dawn approached, Santos prepared for the changing of the guard ceremony. This was when she would discover that her shadow companion was far more than a trick of light. As the incoming guard approached, the shadow began to materialize into a visible form. Santos watched in amazement as a soldier from a different era took shape beside her. He was tall and distinguished, wearing a World War II-era dress uniform that was immaculate in every detail. His bearing was unmistakably that of a senior non-commissioned officer, someone who had spent decades perfecting military courtesy and protocol. But what caught Santos' attention most was the expression on his face. It was one of intense pride and satisfaction, as if he had just witnessed something that exceeded his highest expectations. The ghostly soldier stepped forward and rendered a salute that was textbook perfect in execution. Santos returned the salute with equal precision, understanding instinctively that she was participating in a ceremony that transcended the normal military protocol. When their salutes were complete, the spirit began to speak in a voice that carried decades of experience and wisdom. He introduced himself as Sergeant Major Thomas Mitchell, who had served as the senior enlisted advisor for Arlington National Cemetery during the 1940s and 1950s. Mitchell had been personally involved in establishing many of the protocols and traditions that modern tomb guards still followed. He had died in 1958 and was buried in Arlington Section 3, but apparently, death had not ended his commitment to the mission. Mitchell explained to Santos that he had been watching the tomb guards for decades, observing their dedication and evaluating their commitment to the sacred duty. He told her that she was one of the finest guards he had ever observed, living or dead. Her attention to detail, her respect for the mission, and her understanding of what the tomb represented had impressed even the spirits who resided in Arlington. But Mitchell had more than compliments to offer. He began sharing insights about the tomb and its significance that weren't included in any training manual. He explained that the unknown soldiers weren't just symbolic representatives of all unidentified war dead. They were active spiritual presences who were very much aware of the guards who protected their rest. Mitchell revealed that the unknowns had specifically requested that certain guards be assigned to their protection. Guards who showed exceptional dedication and spiritual connection to the mission. Santos learned that she was one of those specially chosen guards. The unknowns had been watching her since her first day of training, evaluating her commitment and character. They had requested that Mitchell serve as her spiritual mentor, teaching her things about the tomb's significance that couldn't be learned from textbooks or training programs. Over the following weeks, Mitchell appeared regularly during Santos' shifts. He taught her about the history of Arlington that wasn't recorded in official documents. He shared stories of soldiers who had visited their own graves, of families who had been reunited in death, of miracles that occurred regularly but were never publicized. Mitchell helped Santos understand that Arlington wasn't just a cemetery. It was a spiritual community where the bonds of military service continued beyond death. Mitchell also revealed the existence of other spiritual guardians who protected different areas of Arlington. Each section had its own protector, usually a senior enlisted soldier or officer who had demonstrated exceptional dedication during life. These spiritual guardians worked together to ensure that Arlington remained a place of honor, respect, and protection for all who rested there. But perhaps most importantly, Mitchell taught Santos about her role in the spiritual ecosystem of Arlington. As a living guard, she served as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Her dedication and sacrifice were witnessed and appreciated by thousands of spirits who understood better than anyone what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. Santos' training with Mitchell culminated in a ceremony that few living people have ever witnessed. Mitchell led her to the tomb during a particularly peaceful midnight hour and introduced her to the spiritual presence of the unknown soldiers themselves. Santos couldn't see them clearly, but she could feel their presence, their gratitude, their approval of her service. The unknowns communicated not through words, but through emotions and impressions that filled Santos' mind with understanding. She learned that each unknown represented not just the soldiers whose identities were lost, but all soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Their spiritual presence at Arlington served as a focal point for the gratitude and remembrance of the entire nation. Santos understood that her encounter with Mitchell and the unknowns had changed her fundamentally. She was no longer just a guard performing a duty. She was a participant in something spiritual and eternal, a living representative of the bonds that connect all who serve in uniform. Her remaining time as a tomb guard would be marked by a deeper understanding of her mission and a stronger connection to those she was honored to protect. Mitchell's appearances became less frequent as Santos' spiritual education progressed, but he never completely disappeared. He remained available for guidance and support, a reminder that the tomb guards were never truly alone in their vigil. Santos came to understand that every guard who showed exceptional dedication would eventually encounter their own spiritual mentor, their own connection to the greater community of Arlington's honored dead. As Santos' story demonstrates, the supernatural encounters at Arlington aren't random or meaningless. They're part of a carefully orchestrated system where the spirits of the dead continue to serve by guiding and protecting the living. The guardian angel of the unknowns, Sergeant Major Mitchell, represents the best of military leadership continuing beyond death to ensure that the sacred mission is carried out with the honor and dedication it deserves. But Santos would soon discover that her spiritual education was far from complete. Her next encounter would involve multiple spirits working together to prevent a tragedy, proving that the protective nature of Arlington's spiritual community extends far beyond the boundaries of the cemetery itself. Private First Class David Kim had been assigned to Arlington National Cemetery for only 3 weeks, when he encountered what would later be described as the most dramatic and life-saving supernatural intervention in the cemetery's recorded history. Kim's experience would prove that the spirits of Arlington aren't just concerned with ceremonial duties and spiritual guidance. Sometimes they actively intervene to protect the living from mortal danger. The night began like any other. Clear skies, moderate temperature, and the familiar routine of the sacred watch. Kim had been performing his duties with the precision and dedication expected of all tomb guards, but he was still learning the subtle rhythms and patterns that made Arlington unique. He had heard whispered stories from other guards about supernatural encounters, but his pragmatic nature led him to dismiss these tales as the product of overactive imaginations and sleep deprivation. That skepticism would be shattered at exactly 2:15 in the morning when Kim heard something that made his blood run cold. The distinctive sound of reveille, the military bugle call that signals the beginning of each day, began echoing across Arlington's grounds. But this wasn't the scheduled dawn reveille that occurred every morning. This was happening in the middle of the night, and it was coming from multiple locations simultaneously. Kim's training had taught him to maintain his post regardless of distractions, but the midnight reveille was so unusual, so urgent in its tone, that he felt compelled to investigate. The bugle calls seemed to be coming from at least a dozen different locations throughout the cemetery, creating a surreal symphony that filled the night air with military precision and unmistakable urgency. As Kim listened more carefully, he realized that the reveille wasn't being played by living musicians. The sound had an ethereal quality that suggested supernatural origin. More importantly, the multiple bugle calls seemed to be coordinated, as if dozens of ghostly musicians were working together to deliver an urgent message to anyone who would listen. Kim activated his communication system and reported the unusual activity to Arlington's security center. The response was immediate and alarming. The security personnel had detected no audio anomalies on their electronic monitoring systems. According to their equipment, Arlington was completely silent except for Kim's own footsteps and breathing. Yet Kim could clearly hear the reveille calls continuing from multiple directions. The breakthrough came when Kim realized that the bugle calls weren't random. They were directing his attention to specific areas of the cemetery, guiding him towards something important. Following his military instincts, Kim began moving in the direction indicated by the strongest reveille call, all while maintaining radio contact with security personnel who were monitoring his every move. What Kim discovered would save multiple lives and prove that the supernatural residents of Arlington were capable of awareness and intervention that extended far beyond the cemetery's boundaries. The reveille calls were leading him toward Arlington's perimeter, specifically to an area where the cemetery bordered a busy highway that connected Washington, D.C. with the surrounding Virginia suburbs. As Kim approached the perimeter fence, he could see that something was terribly wrong on the highway below. A massive traffic accident had occurred, involving multiple vehicles and creating a hazardous situation that threatened to become much worse. Emergency vehicles hadn't arrived yet, and Kim could see that several people were trapped in damaged cars that were in immediate danger from ongoing traffic and potential fire hazards. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. The midnight reveille calls weren't just alerting Kim to the accident. They were providing him with tactical information about how to respond. Different bugle calls from different directions were guiding him to specific locations where he could best observe the scene and coordinate with emergency responders. The spirits of Arlington were essentially conducting a supernatural emergency response operation. Kim immediately contacted Arlington's security center and emergency services, providing detailed information about the accident and the assistance needed. His position at the cemetery's perimeter gave him a perfect vantage point to direct emergency vehicles to the scene and coordinate rescue efforts. But the supernatural assistance didn't stop there. As emergency responders arrived and began working to extract trapped victims, Kim continued to hear reveille calls that seemed to provide strategic guidance about the rescue operation. The calls directed his attention to hazards that the emergency workers couldn't see from their ground-level perspective. A fuel leak here, unstable wreckage there, a victim who had been missed by the initial assessment. Kim found himself serving as an aerial spotter, relaying critical information to the rescue teams below. His elevated position and the supernatural guidance he was receiving made him incredibly effective at coordinating the complex rescue operation. Emergency responders later credited Kim's assistance with saving at least 3 lives and preventing the accident from becoming a much larger catastrophe. The midnight reveille continued throughout the rescue operation, providing Kim with a constant stream of tactical information that proved invaluable to the emergency responders. It was as if an entire team of supernatural military strategists were working together to ensure the rescue mission's success. The bugle calls only ceased when the last victim had been extracted and transported to safety. Kim's debriefing after the incident raised more questions than it answered. Security cameras had recorded his movement to the perimeter fence, but they had detected no audio anomalies that would account for the reveille calls he had heard. Electronic monitoring equipment showed no unusual electromagnetic activity. Yet Kim's assistance had been crucial to the success of the rescue operation, and his information had been remarkably accurate and timely. Investigation into the source of Kim's supernatural guidance revealed something remarkable. Research into Arlington's burial records showed that the area of the cemetery where Kim had been posted was home to numerous military musicians, including several who had served as official Army buglers during various conflicts. These included Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, who had served as the official bugler for Arlington during the 1960s, and Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, who had been known for her ability to coordinate complex ceremonial music programs. The implications were staggering. The spirits of Arlington's military musicians had somehow detected the emergency situation developing outside the cemetery and had worked together to alert a living guard who could coordinate an effective response. Their midnight reveille had served as both an alarm and a communication system, providing tactical guidance that saved lives. Kim's experience fundamentally changed his understanding of his role as a tomb guard. He realized that the supernatural residents of Arlington weren't confined to the cemetery's boundaries. They were aware of events in the surrounding area and were willing to intervene when innocent lives were at stake. The midnight reveille had proven that the protective nature of Arlington's spirits extended far beyond the graves they guarded. Word of Kim's experience spread quietly through the tomb guard community, adding another layer to their understanding of the supernatural ecosystem that surrounded them. Guards began to pay closer attention to unusual sounds and sensations, understanding that these might be attempts by the spirits to communicate important information. Kim continued his service as a tomb guard with a new appreciation for the complexity and scope of the spiritual community he served alongside. He never again heard the midnight reveille, but he remained alert to other forms of supernatural communication, understanding that he was part of a network that included both the living and the dead in service to something greater than themselves. But Kim's encounter with the midnight reveille was just one example of how Arlington's spirits could work together to achieve remarkable results. His next supernatural experience would involve a much more personal intervention, one that would prove that the bonds between soldiers transcend not only death but also the boundaries of time, rank, and military branch. Specialist Jennifer Walsh had joined the Army as a combat medic, driven by a desire to save lives rather than take them. Her assignment to the tomb guard was both an honor and a challenge, requiring her to transition from battlefield medicine to ceremonial duty. But her medical training would prove invaluable during an encounter that would demonstrate the remarkable dedication of Arlington's spiritual residents to continuing their service beyond death. The incident began during a humid August night when thunderstorms threatened but hadn't yet arrived. The air was thick with moisture and electricity, creating an atmosphere that seemed to amplify every sound and sensation. Walsh had been on duty for approximately 3 hours when she first noticed the unusual scent in the air. It wasn't the typical smell of approaching rain or the familiar aromas of Arlington's carefully maintained grounds. This was something distinctly medical, reminiscent of the antiseptic cleaners used in field hospitals and medical facilities. Walsh's medical background made her immediately alert to anything that might indicate a health emergency. The scent grew stronger as the night progressed, and she began to notice other unusual phenomena. The temperature around the tomb seemed to fluctuate wildly, dropping suddenly and then returning to normal within seconds. These weren't the gradual changes typical of weather patterns, but sharp, sudden shifts that suggested some kind of supernatural presence. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, Walsh encountered something that would challenge every assumption she had made about the relationship between the living and the dead. Emerging from the shadows near the tomb came a figure in what appeared to be a World War II-era medical corps uniform. The spirit was clearly a medic, identifiable by the distinctive red cross on his helmet and the medical bag he carried with practiced familiarity. But this wasn't a casual supernatural encounter. The phantom medic approached Walsh with obvious urgency, gesturing for her to follow him toward a section of Arlington where many World War II veterans rested. Walsh found herself torn between maintaining her post and following what appeared to be a genuine medical emergency. Her training as a medic ultimately overrode her ceremonial duties, and she began following the spirit toward the indicated area. The phantom medic moved with the purposeful stride of someone responding to a medical crisis. As they walked, Walsh could see that his uniform bore the insignia of the 101st Airborne Division, and his medical bag appeared to be fully equipped with period-appropriate medical supplies. More remarkably, the spirit seemed to be solid enough to cast shadows and disturb loose leaves as he walked, suggesting a level of materialization that Walsh had never heard described in other supernatural encounters. Their destination was a grave marker in Section 60, where many recent casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan operations were buried. The phantom medic stopped beside a specific grave and began performing what appeared to be a medical assessment. Walsh watched in amazement as the spirit knelt beside the headstone and began going through the motions of treating an invisible patient with techniques and procedures that were clearly from his own era of service. Walsh realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. The phantom medic was treating the spirit of a recently fallen soldier, using his World War II medical training to help a casualty from a completely different conflict. The dedication implicit in this act was overwhelming. This medic had been dead for decades, yet he was still responding to medical emergencies, still trying to save lives, still committed to the oath he had taken to help his fellow soldiers. The phantom medic looked up at Walsh and began communicating through gestures and expressions rather than words. Walsh's medical training allowed her to understand what he was trying to convey. The recently buried soldier's spirit was suffering from what appeared to be spiritual trauma, the supernatural equivalent of the psychological wounds that many combat veterans carried. The phantom medic needed assistance from a living medic to complete his treatment. Walsh knelt beside the grave and began applying her own medical knowledge to the spiritual emergency. She couldn't see the wounded spirit directly, but she could follow the phantom medic's guidance and provide support for his treatment efforts. Together, they worked to heal wounds that transcended the physical, addressing trauma that had followed the soldier beyond death. The collaborative treatment session lasted nearly an hour. Walsh found herself drawing on every aspect of her medical training, adapting techniques designed for living patients to help treat a spiritual emergency. The phantom medic proved to be an excellent teacher, sharing knowledge and techniques that bridged the gap between World War II battlefield medicine and modern trauma treatment. As the treatment progressed, Walsh began to sense changes in the atmosphere around the grave. The oppressive feeling of trauma and pain that had been present when they arrived began to lift. The air seemed clearer, more peaceful. Walsh realized that their efforts were succeeding, that they were actually healing spiritual wounds that had been preventing the fallen soldier from finding peace in death. The breakthrough came when Walsh felt a sudden sense of gratitude and relief that seemed to emanate from the grave itself. The recently fallen soldier's spirit had been healed of his spiritual trauma and was finally able to rest peacefully. The phantom medic rose from his kneeling position and rendered a perfect military salute toward the headstone, a gesture that Walsh immediately understood and returned. The phantom medic then turned to Walsh and extended his hand in gratitude. When their hands touched, Walsh experienced something she would never forget. She felt the full weight of the medic's decades of service, his countless acts of healing, his dedication to preserving life in the face of overwhelming death and destruction. She understood that his commitment to helping others hadn't ended with his death, but had evolved into something even more profound. Before fading away, the phantom medic communicated one final message to Walsh. He revealed that there were many spirits in Arlington who continued to serve in their areas of expertise, providing help and guidance to both the living and the recently dead. Medics continued to heal, chaplains continued to provide spiritual comfort, and officers continued to lead and protect. Death hadn't ended their service. It had simply changed the nature of their mission. Walsh's encounter with the phantom medic fundamentally changed her understanding of her dual role as both a tomb guard and a medical professional. She realized that her medical skills might be needed not just for living emergencies, but for spiritual ones as well. The phantom medic had shown her that the healing mission could continue beyond death, and that living medics could play a crucial role in that ongoing mission. Research into Arlington's records revealed that Walsh's description of the phantom medic matched perfectly with that of Corporal Timothy Morrison, a 101st Airborne medic who had died during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. Morrison had been posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his heroic efforts to treat wounded soldiers under enemy fire. His burial records showed that he had been interred in Section 15 in 1949, when his remains were finally recovered and returned to the United States. Walsh's experience proved that the spiritual community of Arlington included medical professionals who continued to provide care and healing beyond death. The phantom medic's final mission had been to heal a fellow soldier's spiritual wounds, and he had enlisted the help of a living medic to complete that mission successfully. But Walsh's supernatural education was far from complete. Her encounter with the phantom medic had somehow marked her as someone the spirits could trust with medical emergencies that transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. Her next encounter would involve not healing the dead, but using supernatural assistance to save the life of a living person in immediate danger. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had always believed that preparation and vigilance were the keys to successful military service. His background in military intelligence had taught him to notice patterns, to analyze threats, and to prepare for contingencies that others might overlook. These skills would prove invaluable during an encounter that would demonstrate the protective nature of Arlington's spiritual residents in the most dramatic way possible. The night began with unusual atmospheric conditions that made Thompson immediately alert. A thick fog had rolled in from the Potomac River, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet in most areas of the cemetery. The fog wasn't moving in the typical patterns Thompson had observed during his 6 months as a tomb guard. Instead, it seemed to be gathering in specific areas, almost as if it were being directed by some unseen intelligence. Thompson maintained his post with characteristic precision, but he began noticing other anomalies that suggested something significant was about to occur. The temperature fluctuations that many guards had reported were more extreme than usual. Electronic equipment was experiencing minor malfunctions that couldn't be explained by weather conditions. Most unsettling of all, Thompson began hearing what sounded like urgent, whispered conversations coming from multiple directions throughout the cemetery. At approximately 1:45 in the morning, Thompson encountered something that would forever change his understanding of the supernatural residents of Arlington. Multiple spirits began materializing around the tomb simultaneously, creating the largest gathering of supernatural entities that any guard had ever reported. These weren't random apparitions, but organized groups of spirits working together with obvious coordination and purpose. The spirits represented different eras of American military service. Thompson could identify uniforms and insignia from the Civil War, both World War Wars, Korea, Vietnam, and more recent conflicts. What was most remarkable was their level of organization. They had formed into distinct groups based on their areas of expertise: intelligence specialists, security personnel, combat veterans, and communications experts. Each group seemed to be focused on a specific aspect of an overall mission. Thompson watched in amazement as the spiritual intelligence specialists began sharing information with their security counterparts. The communication was silent but obviously effective, as the security spirits immediately began positioning themselves around the perimeter of the tomb area. The combat veterans formed defensive positions that would have been tactically sound for any military operation. This wasn't a casual supernatural gathering. This was a military operation being conducted by the dead. The breakthrough came when one of the intelligence spirits approached Thompson directly. The spirit was wearing the uniform of a Vietnam-era military intelligence officer, and his bearing suggested someone with extensive experience in threat assessment and counterintelligence operations. When he began communicating with Thompson, it became clear that Arlington's spiritual residents had detected a genuine threat to the cemetery and its living guardians. The spirit revealed that hostile individuals were planning to conduct an attack on Arlington National Cemetery within the next few hours. The attack was intended to desecrate the tomb and harm any guards who tried to stop them. The Spiritual Intelligence Network had been monitoring the threat for weeks, gathering information about the attackers' plans, timing, and methods. Now they were mobilizing to protect both the sacred site and the living soldiers who guarded it. Thompson found himself being briefed on the most comprehensive threat assessment he had ever encountered. The spirits had identified the number of attackers, their likely approach routes, their weapons and equipment, and their intended targets. The level of detail was extraordinary, surpassing anything that living intelligence agencies could have gathered in such a short time frame. The spirits had access to information sources and surveillance methods that transcended normal limitations. But the supernatural intelligence briefing was just the beginning. The spirits began coordinating a defense plan that would utilize both supernatural and conventional resources. They instructed Thompson on specific actions he should take to ensure his own safety while simultaneously protecting the tomb. They provided him with tactical information about defensive positions, communication protocols, and coordination with incoming security reinforcements. Thompson activated Arlington's security alert system and relayed the threat information to appropriate authorities. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Security teams began converging on the cemetery, while law enforcement agencies initiated broader security measures. But Thompson knew that the conventional response, while necessary, wouldn't be sufficient to stop attackers who had planned their assault with such precision. The supernatural defense operation that followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. The spirits of Arlington coordinated a multi-layered defensive strategy that combined their supernatural abilities with conventional security measures. Intelligence spirits provided real-time updates on the attackers' movements. Security spirits created supernatural barriers and diversions that confused and disoriented the hostile individuals. Combat veterans provided tactical guidance that helped living security personnel position themselves most effectively. The attack, when it came, was stopped before it could even begin. The hostile individuals found themselves completely disoriented by supernatural interventions that they couldn't understand or counter. Fog appeared and disappeared in patterns that blocked their vision and confused their navigation. Sounds and voices led them away from their intended targets. Equipment malfunctioned in ways that couldn't be explained by normal technical problems. Meanwhile, Thompson and the living security teams were receiving continuous updates and guidance from their supernatural allies. The spirits provided advance warning of every hostile movement, allowing the defenders to stay ahead of the attackers at every stage of the encounter. The coordination between the living and the dead was seamless, creating a defensive network that was virtually impenetrable. The hostile individuals were captured before they could reach the tomb or harm any personnel. Law enforcement officials were amazed by the precision and effectiveness of the defensive operation, crediting the success to exceptional intelligence gathering and tactical coordination. They had no idea that the real heroes of the operation were the spirits of Arlington, who had organized and executed one of the most sophisticated defensive operations in military history. Thompson's debriefing revealed the full scope of what had occurred. The spirits of Arlington had been maintaining their own intelligence network, monitoring potential threats to the cemetery and its personnel. When they detected a credible threat, they had mobilized their resources and coordinated with living defenders to neutralize the danger. The attack had been stopped not by conventional security measures alone, but by a partnership between the living and the dead that transcended normal understanding. The incident proved that Arlington's spiritual residents weren't just concerned with ceremonial duties and personal guidance. They were actively protecting the cemetery and its living guardians from real-world threats. Their supernatural abilities, combined with their military expertise and dedication to the mission, made them incredibly effective defenders of the sacred site they called home. Thompson's experience fundamentally changed the security posture at Arlington National Cemetery. While the supernatural aspects of the defensive operation remained classified, the effectiveness of the intelligence gathering and threat assessment led to enhanced security protocols that incorporated lessons learned from the incident. Thompson found himself serving as an unofficial liaison between the living security forces and the supernatural intelligence network that continued to monitor potential threats. But Thompson's role as a bridge between the living and the dead would extend far beyond security operations. His next encounter would involve a spiritual mission of mercy that would demonstrate the humanitarian nature of Arlington's supernatural community and their commitment to helping both the living and the dead find peace and resolution. Staff Sergeant Rachel Martinez had been serving as a tomb guard for 8 months when she encountered what would become known as the most emotionally powerful supernatural event in Arlington National Cemetery's history. Martinez's experience would prove that the spirits of Arlington weren't just concerned with military protocol and security operations. They also cared deeply about ensuring that no soldier, living or dead, was ever forgotten or left behind. The encounter began during a cold December night when the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. The snow created a hushed atmosphere that seemed to muffle all sound except the steady rhythm of Martinez's footsteps on the marble plaza. The tomb looked particularly beautiful under its blanket of fresh snow, and Martinez found herself reflecting on the countless soldiers who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. At approximately 11:30, Martinez began hearing something that would touch her heart in ways she never could have imagined. Voices, dozens of them, calling out names with military precision. But these weren't the voices of living soldiers conducting a normal roll call. These were the voices of the dead, and they were calling the names of soldiers who had never been properly honored or remembered. Martinez paused to listen more carefully, trying to understand what she was witnessing. The voices seemed to be coming from throughout Arlington, as if spirits from every section of the cemetery were participating in a massive, coordinated ceremony. Each name was called out clearly and respectfully, followed by a moment of silence before the next name was announced. Martinez realized she was hearing the most comprehensive roll call in military history. But this wasn't a random recitation of names. As Martinez listened, she began to understand the purpose behind this supernatural ceremony. The spirits were calling the names of soldiers who had died in obscurity, whose sacrifices had been forgotten, whose families had never received proper recognition for their loss. This was a roll call for the forgotten heroes, the overlooked casualties, the soldiers who had somehow slipped through the cracks of official remembrance. Martinez watched in amazement as spirits began materializing throughout the cemetery to answer the roll call. These weren't the decorated officers and famous heroes whose graves attracted thousands of visitors. These were the forgotten soldiers, the ones whose stories had never been told, whose names appeared on no monuments, whose sacrifices had been lost to time and bureaucratic oversight. Each spirit who answered the roll call stepped forward with dignity and pride, their military bearing intact despite decades or centuries of neglect. Martinez could see soldiers from every American conflict, representing every branch of service, every rank, every background. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to remember them, to acknowledge their service, to welcome them into the brotherhood of honored dead. The ceremony was being conducted by what appeared to be senior non-commissioned officers from different eras, working together to ensure that every forgotten soldier received proper recognition. Martinez watched as they checked names against what appeared to be supernatural records, ensuring that no one was overlooked, that every sacrifice was acknowledged, that every soldier finally received the honor they had earned but never received in life. But the most moving moment came when Martinez realized that some of the names being called belonged to soldiers who were still alive. These were veterans who had served with distinction but had never received proper recognition for their sacrifices. The spirits were conducting a roll call that included both the living and the dead, ensuring that no act of service went unnoticed or unappreciated. Martinez found herself emotionally overwhelmed by what she was witnessing. The dedication of the spirits to their forgotten comrades was extraordinary. They had organized this ceremony not for themselves, but for others who had been overlooked and forgotten. It was an act of pure military brotherhood that transcended death itself. As the ceremony continued, Martinez began to understand her own role in what was occurring. The spirits needed a living witness to their roll call, someone who could carry the message back to the world of the living that no soldier had been forgotten, that every sacrifice had been recorded and remembered by those who understood sacrifice better than anyone. Martinez watched as the ceremony concluded with a moment of silence that seemed to encompass the entire cemetery. The spirits who had answered the roll call stood at attention in perfect formation, their faces showing the peace and satisfaction that comes from finally being recognized and honored. They had waited decades or centuries for this moment, and their patience had finally been rewarded. The senior non-commissioned officers who had conducted the ceremony approached Martinez with expressions of gratitude and respect. Through gestures and impressions rather than words, they communicated that Martinez had been chosen to witness the ceremony because of her own dedication to honoring the dead. They wanted her to understand that Arlington's mission extended far beyond the famous graves and well-known monuments. Martinez learned that the spirits of Arlington maintained their own records of service and sacrifice, ensuring that no soldier was ever truly forgotten, even if the living world had overlooked them. The roll call she had witnessed was conducted regularly, whenever enough forgotten soldiers had been identified to warrant a formal ceremony of recognition and welcome. But the spirits had one more surprise for Martinez. They began showing her visions of living veterans who needed help and recognition, soldiers who were struggling with the transition to civilian life, who felt forgotten and overlooked by the society they had served. The spirits wanted Martinez to understand that their mission of remembrance extended to the living as well as the dead. Martinez realized that her encounter with the final roll call had given her a new mission that would extend far beyond her service as a tomb guard. She had been chosen to serve as an advocate for forgotten soldiers, both living and dead, to ensure that their sacrifices were recognized and their stories are told. The spirits had enlisted her in a campaign of remembrance that would continue for the rest of her life. Research into military records would later confirm many of the names Martinez had heard during the supernatural roll call. These were indeed soldiers whose sacrifices had been overlooked or forgotten, whose families had never received proper recognition, whose stories had been lost to bureaucratic errors or simple neglect. Martinez's testimony would help bring recognition to dozens of forgotten heroes. Martinez's experience with the final roll call became a turning point in her understanding of military service and sacrifice. She realized that the true measure of a soldier's worth wasn't found in medals or monuments, but in the willingness to serve something greater than themselves. The spirits of Arlington had taught her that every act of service, no matter how small or overlooked, was valuable and worthy of remembrance. But Martinez's education in the supernatural mysteries of Arlington was about to reach its culmination. Her final encounter would involve not just individual spirits or small groups, but the entire spiritual community of Arlington working together to deliver a message that would change her understanding of life, death, and the eternal bonds that connect all who serve in uniform.
Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez had been guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier for 8 months when he first saw him. The Phantom Sentry, as Rodriguez would later call him in his incident report. A report that would mysteriously disappear from official records just 3 days after submission. It was November 15, 2018. The kind of night that makes your bones ache with cold. A thick fog had rolled in from the Potomac River, wrapping Arlington Cemetery in an ethereal shroud that seemed to muffle even the distant sounds of Washington, D.C. traffic. Rodriguez was on the midnight shift, the graveyard watch as the guards called it. Though none of them used that phrase lightly anymore. The tomb of the unknown soldier sits atop a hill in Arlington, overlooking the capital city. During the day, thousands of visitors come to pay their respects, watching the ceremonial changing of the guard with reverent silence. But at night, when the crowds disappear and the fog rolls in, the tomb becomes something else entirely, something that feels ancient and watchful. Rodriguez had completed his first hour of duty without incident. 21 steps south along the black mat, pause for 21 seconds, execute a precise about-face, pause again, then 21 steps north. The rhythm was hypnotic, meditative even. Each step measured exactly 24 inches. Each pause exactly 21 seconds. Precision was everything. Respect was everything. But at 1:17 a.m., as Rodriguez reached the southern end of his patrol route, he noticed something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. There, standing at attention beside the tomb itself, was another guard. Now, you might think, so what? Maybe it was time for the changing of the guard. Maybe there was some special ceremony Rodriguez hadn't been briefed on. But Rodriguez knew better. He knew the schedule by heart. He knew every protocol, every procedure. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was supposed to be alone on that platform. The figure stood perfectly still, facing the tomb. Rodriguez could make out the distinctive silhouette of the dress blue uniform, the white gloves, the ceremonial rifle. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The uniform seemed faded, as if bleached by decades of sunlight, and the figure itself appeared translucent in the swirling fog, like looking at someone through frosted glass. Rodriguez felt his training kick in. Despite the fear crawling up his spine like ice-cold fingers, he maintained his composure. He continued his patrol, but his eyes never left the mysterious figure. Step by measured step, he approached the northern end of his route, all the while watching the phantom guard who stood motionless beside the tomb. As Rodriguez executed his about-face at the northern end, he expected to find the figure gone. A trick of fog and shadow, perhaps, his mind playing tricks after months of midnight shifts. But the Phantom Sentry was still there, still standing at perfect attention. That's when Rodriguez noticed something that nearly shattered his military bearing entirely. The Phantom Guard was performing his own patrol, but he was walking through the tomb itself. Rodriguez watched in horror as the translucent figure took 21 measured steps directly through the marble sarcophagus, paused, executed an about-face, and walked back through it again. The Phantom's boots made no sound on the marble. His movement created no disturbance in the fog. He was there but not there, present but from another time entirely. For 45 minutes, Rodriguez continued his patrol while the Phantom Sentry performed his own ghostly watch. 2 guards, separated by decades or perhaps even a century, both honoring their sacred duty to America's unknown heroes. Rodriguez later described it as the most beautiful and terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed. But here's where the story takes an even more chilling turn. At exactly 2 a.m., as Rodriguez completed another lap of his patrol route, the Phantom Guard suddenly stopped his ghostly march through the tomb. For the first time since Rodriguez had noticed him, the spirit turned away from the marble sarcophagus and looked directly at Rodriguez. The living guard felt those eyes bore into his soul, eyes that held the weight of eternal duty, the sadness of forgotten sacrifice, and something else. Something that made Rodriguez's knees weak and his hands tremble despite his iron discipline. Recognition. The Phantom Guard raised his right hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Not to the tomb, not to the flag, but to Rodriguez himself. A salute from one sentinel to another. A passing of the watch across the boundaries of life and death. Rodriguez, his training taking over even in the face of the impossible, returned the salute with crisp military precision. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two guards acknowledged each other across the veil between worlds. Then the Phantom Sentry executed one final about-face, took 21 steps directly into the fog-shrouded hillside, and vanished. Rodriguez completed his shift in a state of shock. When the Dawn Guard arrived for the 6 a.m. changing of the guard ceremony, Rodriguez debriefed him on the standard overnight occurrences: weather conditions, visitor activity, equipment status. But he said nothing about the Phantom Sentry. Not yet. It wasn't until later that morning, after Rodriguez had returned to his quarters and tried unsuccessfully to sleep, that he decided to research the history of the Tomb Guard. What he found in the archives made his encounter even more unsettling. The uniform the Phantom had worn wasn't current military dress. The cut, the insignia, even the style of the cap all belonged to an earlier era. Specifically, Rodriguez determined the uniform matched those worn by the very first tomb guards in the 1920s, shortly after the unknown soldier was entombed. But there was something else in those dusty records. Something that made Rodriguez's hands shake as he read. On November 15, 1923, exactly 95 years to the day before Rodriguez's encounter, a guard named Private James Mitchell had collapsed and died while on duty at the tomb. Heart attack, the record stated. He was found at his post at dawn, still standing at attention, still honoring his watch even in death. Private Mitchell had been 22 years old, the same age as the Phantom Guard Rodriguez had encountered. Rodriguez filed his incident report that afternoon, documenting every detail of his supernatural encounter. He included his research findings, the historical parallels, and his absolute conviction that he had witnessed something beyond the realm of normal experience. 3 days later, when Rodriguez went to check on the status of his report, he was told no such document existed. There was no record of any incident report filed by Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez on November 15, 2018. The duty logs for that night showed nothing unusual, just routine patrol, weather conditions normal, no incidents to report. But Rodriguez knew what he had seen, and more importantly, he knew he wasn't alone in seeing it. Because over the next several weeks, as Rodriguez quietly asked around among his fellow guards, he discovered that phantom sentries at the tomb of the unknown soldier weren't uncommon at all. They were just something nobody talked about, something that got quietly swept under the rug, dismissed as stress or imagination or tricks of light and shadow. But Rodriguez also learned something else, something that would connect his experience to 4 other guards and their own terrifying encounters with the supernatural residents of Arlington Cemetery. The Phantom Guards weren't just randomly appearing. They were trying to communicate something urgent, something that the living guards needed to understand before it was too late. What that message was, Rodriguez wouldn't understand until he met the other witnesses, until he heard their stories and began to piece together a pattern that revealed a truth more frightening than any single ghostly encounter. A truth that suggested the phantom sentries weren't just echoes of the past, but harbingers of something dark approaching Arlington National Cemetery, something that threatened the eternal rest of America's unknown heroes, and something that only the living guards could stop.
Corporal Anthony Rivera /S final night as a tomb guard would become the most significant supernatural encounter in Arlington National Cemetery /S recorded history. Rivera /S experience would reveal the true nature and purpose of the spiritual community that resided within the cemetery /S hallowed grounds, and it would provide answers to questions that had puzzled guards for generations. /N Rivera had completed 11 months of exemplary service as a tomb guard and was scheduled to transfer to a new assignment the following week. His dedication to the mission had been exceptional, earning him the respect of his living colleagues and, as he was about to discover, the gratitude of the supernatural residents who had been watching his service with keen interest. /N and the night began with atmospheric conditions that every experienced guard would recognize as precursors to supernatural activity. The air was unnaturally still, the temperature was dropping rapidly despite clear skies, and electronic equipment throughout Arlington was experiencing minor fluctuations that suggested significant supernatural presence. But what Rivera was about to witness would exceed anything that had been previously documented. /N at exactly midnight, Rivera began hearing what sounded like a massive military formation assembling throughout Arlington. The sounds came from every direction. Marching feet, the rustle of uniforms, the quiet commands of non-commissioned officers organizing their units. But these weren't isolated incidents like previous guards had reported. This was the sound of an entire army mobilizing for a major operation. /N Rivera maintained his post but watched in amazement as spirits began materializing throughout the cemetery in numbers that defied belief. They came from every section of Arlington, representing every conflict in American history, every branch of service, every rank from private to general. This wasn't a small gathering of individual spirits. This was the entire supernatural population of Arlington assembling for what appeared to be the most significant ceremony in the cemetery /S history. N the spirits organized themselves with military precision that rivaled anything Rivera had witnessed among living soldiers. They formed distinct units based on their historical service, creating a formation that spanned nearly 2 centuries of American military history. Civil War soldiers stood alongside World War veterans. Korean War casualties formed ranks with Vietnam veterans. The most recent casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan took their places beside heroes from every American conflict. /N but this massive assembly wasn't random or chaotic. Every spirit knew exactly where they belonged and what role they played in the larger formation. Rivera realized he was witnessing the ultimate expression of military organization and discipline, a ceremony that could only be conducted by soldiers who had transcended the limitations of individual service and become part of something eternal and universal. N at the center of this massive formation stood a group of spirits whose bearing and decorations marked them as the most senior military leaders in American history. Rivera could identify generals and admirals whose names were legendary, Medal of Honor recipients whose stories had inspired generations of warriors, and command sergeants major whose leadership had shaped the very nature of military service. N these senior leaders approached Rivera with the dignity and authority that had made them legends in life and death. Their message was clear and profound. Rivera had been chosen to receive the ultimate revelation about Arlington National Cemetery and its true purpose in the spiritual ecosystem of American military service. N through a combination of direct communication and spiritual impression. The assembled spirits revealed to Rivera that Arlington wasn't just a cemetery or even a spiritual community. It was the eternal headquarters of American military service, a place where the bonds forged in life continued to operate and strengthen beyond death. Every soldier buried in Arlington remained on active duty in ways that the living rarely understood. N Rivera learned that the supernatural encounters experienced by tomb guards weren't random events but carefully orchestrated contacts designed to educate and inspire the living guardians of the sacred site. Each encounter had been planned and approved by the spiritual leadership of Arlington, designed to teach specific lessons about duty, sacrifice, brotherhood, and the eternal nature of military service. And the spirits revealed that tomb guards were selected not just for their military qualifications, but for their spiritual readiness to serve as bridges between the living and the dead. Each guard who showed exceptional dedication and understanding was gradually introduced to the supernatural community through increasingly significant encounters. Rivera's experiences over the past 11 months had been part of a comprehensive education program designed to prepare him for this ultimate revelation. But the most profound revelation was yet to come. The spirits explained that Arlington supernatural community wasn't passive or limited to the cemetery boundaries. They were actively involved in protecting and guiding American military forces around the world. Every soldier who served with honor and dedication had spiritual guardians watching over them, many of whom were the very heroes resting in Arlington hallowed ground. And Rivera discovered that the bonds between soldiers didn't end with death, but evolved into something even stronger and more meaningful. The spirits of Arlington served as guardian angels for living soldiers, providing protection, guidance, and inspiration in ways that were rarely recognized but always effective. Every successful mission, every life saved, every act of heroism was supported by the spiritual presence of those who had gone before. And the assembled spirits then revealed the ultimate purpose behind Rivera's education and the supernatural encounters experienced by all dedicated tomb guards. They were being prepared to serve as living ambassadors for the eternal brotherhood of American military service. When their time as guards ended, they would carry the knowledge and understanding they had gained back into the living military community, helping to strengthen the bonds that connected all who served. And Rivera's final lesson came in the form of a ceremony that no living person had ever witnessed. The entire supernatural community of Arlington rendered honors not to the tomb or to any individual, but to the concept of service itself. They saluted the idea that some things are worth dying for, that freedom requires sacrifice, and that the bonds forged in military service transcend death itself. And the ceremony concluded, the spiritual leaders of Arlington delivered a final message to Rivera. They charged him with the responsibility of sharing what he had learned, not through dramatic revelations that would sensationalize the supernatural, but through quiet example and dedicated service that would inspire others to understand the true meaning of military brotherhood. And Rivera's transformation from guard to ambassador was complete. He understood now that his service at Arlington had been preparation for a lifetime mission of strengthening the bonds between the living and the dead, between past sacrifice and future service, between individual dedication and eternal brotherhood. And as dawn approached and Rivera prepared to leave his post for the final time, the spirits of Arlington faded back into the mist and shadows from which they had emerged. But their message remained clear and powerful. The watch continues, the brotherhood endures, and no soldier who serves with honor is ever truly alone. And Rivera completed his final inspection and transferred responsibility to his replacement with the knowledge that he was passing along more than just a ceremonial duty. He was transferring guardianship of a sacred trust that connected every American soldier to the heroes who had gone before and the patriots who would serve in years to come. And the 10 supernatural encounters we explored tonight represent just a fraction of the spiritual activity that occurs within Arlington National Cemetery. Each story demonstrates the profound bonds that connect soldiers across time, death, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. These aren't tales of horror or haunting, but stories of hope, dedication, and the eternal nature of military service. And for those who have served in uniform, these encounters offer reassurance that your sacrifice has been witnessed and appreciated by those who understand its true value. For those who have never served, These stories provide insight into the spiritual dimensions of military service and the profound bonds that connect all who answer the call to serve something greater than themselves. And the tomb guards who experienced these encounters were forever changed by their interactions with Arlington/S supernatural community. They understood that their service was part of something larger and more significant than they had ever imagined. They learned that death doesn't dedication, that sacrifice creates eternal bonds, and that the watch continues long after individual soldiers have laid down their arms. And we conclude our journey through these remarkable encounters. Remember that the spirits of Arlington aren't unique or supernatural in the way that horror stories suggest. They simply soldiers who loved their country and their fellow warriors so much that death couldn't end their commitment to serve. They represent the best of military values: duty, honor, country, and above all, loyalty to the brothers and sisters who share the burden of protecting freedom. And if you found these stories as compelling and moving as I hope you did, you'll definitely want to check out our next video exploring 10 of America's most haunted places, where history and the supernatural intersect to create encounters that will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between the living and the dead. Click the end screen now to continue your journey into the supernatural mysteries that surround us every day. And the watch continues. The brotherhood endures. And somewhere in the darkness of Arlington National Cemetery, grateful spirits maintain their eternal vigil, watching over those who serve and protecting the values that make freedom possible. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey into the supernatural side of American military service. Sleep well, knowing that heroes watch over us all. N